They say Willow Lane is where the perfect people go to sleep, but some of us are just better at dreaming with our eyes open. The shadows on Willow Lane do not fall so much as they rise, seeping up from the cracked pavement and the overgrown roots of the ancient oaks, like a dark tide that arrives with the punctuality of a stopped clock. And in the breathless silence of the late afternoon, Evelyn Reed sat in her high-backed wing chair behind the heavy velvet curtains of house number 12, waiting for the light to die completely so that her real work could begin.
She did not move, for movement was a luxury she could rarely afford when the stakes were this high, and the arthritis in her knees was merely a secondary reason for her stillness, serving as a convenient excuse for the outside world, while the true reason was the predator's patience she had cultivated over 40 years of cataloging human error. The air in the room was thick with the scent of old paper and dried lavender, a cloying perfume that masked the underlying smell of damp foundation and decaying wood. And to anyone else, this room would have felt like a museum or a mausoleum, a place where time had calcified into dust. But to Evelyn, it was a command center, a bunker lined with books that were not merely stories, but records, references, and hiding places.
Her eyes, clouded by the milky film of age, but sharpened by a paranoia that had kept her alive when others had faded away, were fixed on the sliver of glass exposed by a deliberate gap in the drapes, a gap no wider than a knife blade, through which she commanded a direct line of sight to the imposing Georgian facade of house number 1.
That was the fortress of Judge Marcus Thorne, a man whose reputation for moral absolutism was as carefully constructed as the brickwork of his home. And as Evelyn watched the last bruised purple of the sunset reflect off his pristine windows, she felt the familiar tightening in her chest that was not fear, but the vibration of a secret trying to claw its way out of her throat. She knew things about the judge that would turn the neighborhood's polite nods into gasps of horror, things that lay dormant in the basement beneath her feet, wrapped in plastic and silence, waiting for the moment when the balance of power on Willow Lane would shift enough to make the truth a weapon rather than a liability. The street outside was deceptively quiet, a stillness that a casual observer might mistake for peace, but Evelyn knew better, for she understood that Willow Lane was an ecosystem of surveillance, where every drawn blind concealed a watcher, and every manicured lawn hid the scars of excavation.
To her left, 2 houses down, the residence of Leo and Maya Chen hummed with the invisible electricity of servers and digital eyes, their smart home a fortress of glass and algorithm that felt alien against the traditional architecture of the street. And further down, the overgrown yard of Silas Blackwood at number 13 seemed to absorb the light rather than reflect it, a black hole of taxidermy and chemical smells that kept even the stray cats at bay.
But it was house number 1 that held the gravity, the center of the web, where Judge Thorne sat like a bloated spider, convinced that his retirement was a sanctuary rather than a waiting room for consequences.
Evelyn shifted her weight, the leather of her chair groaning softly in the gloom, and she reached out with a trembling hand to adjust the brass telescope that sat on the tripod beside her, a relic from the First War that she had purchased at an estate sale 3 decades ago, its lenses scratched but powerful, capable of stripping away the distance between her sanctuary and the judge's sins.
She pressed her eye to the cold metal rim, her breath fogging the eyepiece for a brief second before she controlled her respiration, slowing her heart rate with the discipline of a sniper, and brought the front door of house number 1 into sharp, terrifying focus. The brass knocker, shaped like a lion's head, gleamed with an arrogant polish, and the porch light had just flickered on, a yellow beacon that signaled the judge was awake, alert, and perhaps expecting someone, or perhaps simply afraid of what the darkness might bring to his doorstep. It was a Tuesday, and Tuesdays were usually quiet, a day when the rhythm of the street was dictated by the distant hum of traffic from the main road and the occasional rattle of Martha Higgins's patrol cart as she completed her early rounds. But tonight felt different, heavy, with a barometric pressure that had nothing to do with the weather and everything to do with the alignment of history.
Evelyn had felt it in her bones since morning, a deep ache that signaled a storm of human-making. And now, as she watched a black sedan turn slowly onto Willow Lane, its headlights cutting through the gloom like searchlights, she knew that the timeline she had been monitoring for 20 years was about to rupture.
The car moved with a predatory slowness, crawling past the dark windows of Julian Vane's crypto-funded fortress at number 15, past the silent, lightless bulk of Silas Blackwood's home, and past her own hidden vantage point, the tires crunching softly on the asphalt, as if trying to sneak up on the pavement itself.
She held her breath, her fingers tightening on the focus wheel of the telescope as the vehicle drifted toward the end of the cul-de-sac, toward the one house that had reason to fear the arrival of strangers in the night. And when the brake lights flared red, painting the judge's driveway in the color of fresh blood, Evelyn knew that the overdue account had finally come for collection.
The car engine died, but the lights remained off, plunging the vehicle into a silhouette against the manicured hedges. And for a long minute, nothing happened. A pause that stretched the tension in Evelyn's chest until it felt like a piano wire pulled to the breaking point. She imagined the driver sitting there, checking a piece of paper, or perhaps loading a gun, or maybe just gathering the courage to confront the man who had sold his soul for a gavel and a robe. And then, with a sound that carried clearly through the cold night air, the driver's door opened. A young man stepped out, his movements stiff and jerky, and even from this distance, through the distortion of the antique glass, Evelyn felt a shock of recognition that made her gasp, a sound that was swallowed instantly by the heavy velvet of the room. He was tall, thin to the point of gauntness, wearing a jacket that was too large for his frame. But it was not his clothes that stopped Evelyn's heart. It was the way he held his head, a defiant tilt that she had seen before in a courtroom 20 years ago, on a man who had been dragged away screaming that he was innocent, that the fire was an accident, that the judge had promised him protection. This boy, for he was barely more than a boy, was the ghost of that man, the echo of a life destroyed by Marcus Thorne's ambition. And as he walked up the driveway toward the lion-headed knocker, Evelyn realized that he was the son, the legacy of the arsonist, returned to the scene of the judicial crime to demand answers that could not be given without destroying the fragile peace of Willow Lane.
Evelyn pulled back from the telescope, her mind racing through the catalog of her archives, visualizing the specific box, the specific folder, the specific red tape that bound the transcript she had stolen from the clerk's office in 1998, a theft that had gone unnoticed in the chaos of the appeal, but which now constituted the only leverage she had against the darkness that was gathering across the street. She needed to be sure. She needed to verify that the face she had seen matched the photograph she had clipped from the obituary column 5 years ago when the father had died in prison. And so she leaned back in, pressing her eye so hard against the metal that it hurt, watching as the young man raised his hand to the door. He did not knock. He hesitated, his hand hovering over the wood, and then, as if summoned by a silent command, the door opened inward, revealing the silhouette of Judge Thorne, not in his robe, but in a dressing gown that looked like a shroud, his posture stooped, his head bowed, as if he had been expecting this executioner for a lifetime. There were no shouts, no violent gestures, just a quiet exchange of words that Evelyn could not hear but could feel in the vibration of the air, a transaction of guilt and accusation. And then the judge stepped aside, a gesture of surrender that allowed the young man to cross the threshold and enter the house, the door closing behind them with a finality that echoed like a gunshot in Evelyn's mind. She sat back, her hands trembling in her lap, the silence of her own house suddenly oppressive,
filled with the accusing stares of the books that lined the walls, thousands of stories that had endings, unlike the story unfolding across the street, which was spiraling into a chaos she had long predicted but never truly prepared for.
She knew what was in the red file. She knew the specific lines of testimony that Thorne had stricken from the record, the evidence of the accelerant that had been planted, the payoff that had been routed through a shell company in the Cayman Islands, details that she had memorized and hoarded like a dragon guarding gold that was actually radioactive waste.
She could not stay in the chair. The passive observation was over, and the time for active verification had begun. So she forced her stiff limbs to move, pushing herself up with a groan that was lost in the vastness of the room, and she reached for her cane, the smooth hickory handle cool and reassuring against her palm.
She needed to go down, down into the belly of the house, down to the basement, where the air was stable and the humidity was controlled, where the red file lived in its fireproof box, waiting for the day it would be needed to burn a reputation to the ground.
The hallway was dark, illuminated only by the faint glow of the streetlights filtering through the transom window above the front door, casting long, distorted shadows that danced along the floral wallpaper like specters of the librarians who had lived here before her, women who had also known the value of silence and the power of written words. Her footsteps on the runner carpet were soft, a rhythmic shuffling that she had perfected over years of insomnia, and as she passed the kitchen, she resisted the urge to turn on the light, for light was a signal, a betrayal of presence, and tonight she needed to be a ghost in her own home, invisible to the watchers who might be looking back at her from the Chin House or from the darkness of the Blackwood estate.
The door to the basement was located under the main staircase, a narrow panel of oak that looked like a closet but opened into a descent into history, and Evelyn unlocked it with a key she kept on a chain around her neck, the metal warm from her body heat, the lock tumbling with a heavy oiled click that felt satisfyingly secure.
She opened the door, and a smell hit her instantly. The scent of old paper intensified 1,000 times, mixed with the sharpness of vinegar and the dry, dusty odor of a tomb that had been sealed for centuries, a smell that to her was the perfume of truth.
She flipped the switch at the top of the stairs, and a single bare bulb buzzed to life below, casting a harsh interrogation room light over the wooden steps that descended steeply into the concrete foundation of the house, and Evelyn began her descent, one hand gripping the rail, the other clutching her cane, counting the steps as she went, 1, 2, 3, reciting the numbers like a mantra to ward off the fear that she might slip and break a hip, leaving her to die alone in the dark, with only her secrets for company.
The basement was a labyrinth of metal shelving units, floor-to-ceiling stacks that created narrow aisles of claustrophobic height, filled with boxes, binders, and loose papers, a physical manifestation of her obsessive need to document the world around her, to prove that chaos could be ordered if one simply had enough filing cabinets. She moved to the section marked 1990-1999, her shadow stretching long and thin against the concrete floor, a distorted giant that mimicked her movements with a lag that felt supernatural, though she knew it was merely physics. The box she sought was on the third shelf, a red banker's box that was distinct from the gray and white ones surrounding it, a color choice that was both a warning and a categorization. And as she reached for it, her shoulder screaming in protest, she felt a sudden, irrational conviction that the box would be empty, that someone had come in while she slept and stolen the proof, leaving her with nothing but her paranoia.
But the box was heavy, dense with the weight of condensed suffering, and she pulled it down, setting it on the small reading table she kept in the center of the room, a table illuminated by a green shaded banker's lamp that she switched on with a trembling click. She sat on the wooden stool, her breath coming in short, shallow rasps, and lifted the lid of the box, the cardboard friction creating a sound like a gasp. revealing the contents that had not seen the light of day since the turn of the millennium. There it was, the transcript, bound in a blue legal cover that had faded to gray at the edges, the paper yellowing and brittle, but the typed words still stark and black, accusing and undeniable.
She opened it to page 42, the page where the court stenographer had recorded a disruption, a moment where the defendant had shouted about a man in a black car, a man who had given him the lighter fluid, a man who looked exactly like the young version of Marcus Thorne.
The judge had stricken it from the record, declared it inadmissible hearsay, silenced the court with the bang of his gavel. But Evelyn had the original raw notes, the ones the stenographer had thrown in the trash and which Evelyn, then a junior archivist at the courthouse, had retrieved with shaking hands, knowing that she was holding a grenade.
She ran her finger over the text, the texture of the typewriter ribbon ink still palpable under her skin, and as she read the words, the memory of that day came flooding back, the smell of floor wax and fear in the courtroom, the look in Thorne's eyes, cold and dead as a shark's, as he sentenced an innocent man to a cage, where he would eventually rot.
But now the sun was here, inside the house, and the equation had changed. The debt was no longer abstract. It was physical, present, and potentially violent.
Evelyn closed the file, the dust motes dancing in the cone of green light, and she wondered what was happening across the street at this very second, whether the judge was confessing or begging, or perhaps reaching for the gun he kept in the drawer of his mahogany desk, the pearl-handled revolver that he claimed was a gift from a grateful mayor, but which Evelyn knew was an insurance policy against exactly this kind of night. She needed to know, she needed to see, and the basement, for all its safety, was blind. It offered history but not current intelligence, and so she knew she had to ascend, to go back to the window, to the telescope, to the vigil. She stood up, her knees popping, and left the file on the table, open, a silent accusation waiting for a jury that would never come. And she climbed the stairs, the ascent harder than the descent, her breath laboring as she pulled herself up to the ground floor, emerging back into the hallway where the shadows had lengthened and deepened, transforming the familiar contours of her home into a landscape of threats. She moved back to the living room, to the wing chair, but she did not sit. Instead, she stood by the curtain, pressing her face to the gap, ignoring the cold radiation of the glass against her cheek. The car was still there, a dark stain on the driveway, but the porch light had been extinguished, plunging the front of house number 1 into darkness, a darkness that felt deliberate, tactical, a veil drawn over a crime in progress.
Evelyn adjusted the telescope, panning across the facade of the house, looking for a sliver of light, a movement, anything that would tell her who was winning the confrontation inside. And then she saw it, a flicker in the upstairs study, the room where the judge kept his private library, a room that faced the street with a large bay window, usually covered by heavy blinds.
The blinds were slightly askew, disturbed, as if someone had brushed against them in a struggle or in haste, and through the slats she saw a beam of a flashlight cutting through the dark of the room, an erratic, searching beam that swept over the bookshelves, the desk, the walls.
It was not the steady light of a lamp. It was the frantic searching of an intruder, or perhaps a desperate host looking for something he had lost, and Evelyn watched, mesmerized, as the beam stopped, focusing on a specific section of the wall, a section where she knew, from years of observation and deduction, that the judge kept a wall safe behind a portrait of his late wife.
The flashlight beam held steady, and then a shadow crossed it, the silhouette of the young man, his profile sharp and angular, his hands moving against the wall, manipulating something, perhaps the frame of the painting. And Evelyn realized he wasn't just visiting, he was retrieving. He was taking back what had been stolen from his family. Not money, but truth, or perhaps evidence that the judge had kept as a trophy.
Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat that seemed to echo the tension across the street, and she leaned closer, her breath fogging the glass again,
wiping it away with a frantic swipe of her sleeve. The young man turned, looking away from the safe, looking toward the window, and for a terrifying second, the beam of the flashlight swung around, cutting through the glass, through the darkness of the street, and hitting the lens of her telescope with a blinding flash of white light that made Evelyn recoil with a gasp of pain, her hands flying to her face.
She stumbled back, knocking into the side table, sending a porcelain figurine crashing to the floor, the sound shattering the silence of her house like a scream. And she froze, her heart stopping, waiting for the reaction, waiting for the consequences of her clumsiness. Had he seen the glint of her lens? Had he known he was being watched?
The silence stretched, heavy and suffocating, and then, slowly, terrified, she crept back to the window, avoiding the telescope, peering through the raw gap in the curtains with her naked eye. The light in the study was gone. The window was dark. But the front door of house number 1 was opening again.
The young man stepped out, but he was not alone. He was carrying something, a box, a metal box that looked like a bond tin, and he was moving fast, not with the hesitation of his arrival, but with the urgency of escape. He hurried down the driveway, his head down, clutching the box to his chest, and he reached the car, threw the box into the passenger seat, and scrambled behind the wheel. The engine roared to life, shattering the quiet of the cul-de-sac, and the headlights flared on, blindingly bright, sweeping across the front of Evelyn's house as the car reversed violently, tires screeching on the asphalt. And then, just before he shifted into drive, just before he sped away into the night, the young man looked up, directly at her window, directly at the gap in the curtains where she stood, and even across the distance, even in the chaos of the moment, Evelyn saw him nod, a single, sharp acknowledgement that chilled her blood to absolute zero. He knew. He had always known. Or perhaps the judge had told him.
The car peeled away, racing down Willow Lane, disappearing around the curve, leaving only the smell of burnt rubber and the silence of the aftermath. Evelyn stood there, shaking, her mind reeling with the implications, but her eyes were drawn back to the house, to the open front door of number 1. It was still ajar, swaying slightly in the night breeze. The hallway inside was dark. No one came to close it.
The judge, a man who double-locked his doors even to check the mail, had left his fortress wide open to the night. Evelyn knew, with the certainty of a librarian who knows when a story has reached its inevitable tragedy, that the judge was not coming to the door. She knew that the balance had not just shifted, it had been destroyed. And she knew that she could not stay in her house, safe behind her curtains, not when the door to the mystery was standing wide open, inviting the darkness in. She gripped her cane, her knuckles white, and turned away from the window, looking toward her own front door. She had to go out. She had to cross the street. She had to know what was in the room where the flashlight had been.
She moved through her hallway, the air feeling colder now, the shadows longer, and she reached for the handle of her front door, her hand trembling so badly she could barely turn the latch. She opened it, and the night air rushed in, smelling of ozone and fear, and she stepped out onto her porch, the first time she had left her house after dark in 10 years. The street was empty. The other houses were sleeping, or pretending to sleep.
House number 1 loomed ahead, a dark monolith with a gaping mouth. Evelyn stepped off her porch, her cane clicking on the pavement, a rhythmic countdown to discovery, and she began the long, terrifying walk across the asphalt, her eyes fixed on the open door of the judge's house, where the darkness seemed to be waiting for her, pulsating, alive.
She reached the edge of the judge's driveway, her breath coming in painful gasps, and she looked up at the study window. It was black. She looked at the door. It was still open, just a few inches, revealing a slice of the foyer floor. She walked up the path, the lions on the knocker seemingly mocking her approach, and she reached out a hand, her fingers brushing the cold wood of the door. She didn't want to push it.
She wanted to turn around and run back to her archives, to bury herself in paper and forget she had ever seen the car. But the red file in her basement demanded a conclusion. The story demanded an ending. She pushed the door. It swung inward on silent, well-oiled hinges, revealing the cavernous hallway of Judge Thorne's home.
It was pitch black inside, save for a faint, flickering light coming from the study upstairs, a light that shouldn't be there, a light that looked like the reflection of a fire, or perhaps a candle left burning. And then, from the top of the stairs, from the heart of the darkness, she heard a sound. It was not a moan. It was not a cry. It was the sound of a page turning, a slow, deliberate, dry sound of paper sliding against paper.
Evelyn froze on the threshold, 1 foot in the safety of the night, 1 foot in the terror of the house. The sound came again. Swish. And then a voice, low, gravelly, and impossibly calm, drifted down from the landing, a voice that did not belong to the judge and did not belong to the young man. "You brought the wrong file, Evelyn," the voice whispered, echoing through the empty hall. Evelyn's blood turned to ice. She hadn't brought the file.
It was still on the table in her basement, which meant the voice wasn't talking about what she held in her hands. It was talking about what she held in her mind. She looked up into the dark, her eyes straining, and saw a shape detach itself from the shadows of the banister, a figure, watching her, waiting for her.
The figure took a step forward, the floorboards creaking under a weight that sounded too heavy for a human, and the faint light from the study caught the edge of something metallic in its hand. "Come in," the voice said, and this time it sounded like the house itself was speaking. "We have a lot of reading to do." Evelyn couldn't breathe. She couldn't move.
She could only stare into the abyss of the hallway, realizing that her surveillance had been a two-way mirror all along, and that while she had been watching the street, something inside the street had been watching her. The figure raised its hand, the light flared, and Evelyn stepped forward into the dark.
The darkness inside was not merely an absence of light, but a physical substance that seemed to coat her throat with a taste of stale tobacco and old dust. And as the heavy oak door clicked shut behind her, sealing out the ambient hum of the streetlights and the distant murmur of the sleeping suburbs, Evelyn realized that the silence within House 1 was absolute, a vacuum that sucked the breath from her lungs and left her standing on the precipice of a decision that could not be unmade.
She did not move immediately, for her eyes required precious seconds to adjust to the gloom, forcing her to rely on the auditory landscape of the house, listening for the creak of a floorboard or the rustle of clothing that would betray the location of the figure who had invited her in. But there was only the rhythmic ticking of a grandfather clock somewhere deep in the recesses of the ground floor, a slow, metronomic heartbeat that seemed to mark the remaining seconds of her autonomy.
The foyer was vast, a testament to the judge's ego, lined with wainscoting that felt cool and damp to the touch as she reached out to steady herself, her cane hovering an inch above the Persian rug to avoid the sharp, percussive click that might shatter the fragile truce between her and the shadows.
"The stairs, Evelyn." The voice drifted down again, softer this time, stripped of any threat and replaced with a terrifying, intimate patience, as if he were a doctor waiting for a recalcitrant patient to enter the examination room. And she realized with a jolt of nausea that he knew her name, knew her gait, and likely knew exactly how long it would take her to navigate the treacherous expanse of the hallway.
She began to move, her orthopedic shoes sinking into the thick pile of the runner, each step a silent negotiation with gravity,
her gaze locked on the landing above, where the faint, orange glow of the study flickered like a dying ember, casting long, distorted shadows that danced against the ceiling molding in a macabre pantomime of the secrets this house had kept for 20 years.
As she ascended, the air grew warmer, carrying with it a scent that made her skin crawl, a smell she recognized from the archives of her own memory, the unmistakable, acrid sweetness of accelerant, masked by the heavy perfume of leather bindings and furniture polish, a sensory contradiction that confirmed her deepest fears about the lineage of the man waiting for her.
She reached the landing, her breath coming in ragged, shallow pulls, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird, and she paused to grip the newel post, her knuckles white, staring at the partially open door of the study, the very room she had watched for thousands of hours through her telescope, the room where she had seen money exchange hands, where she had seen the judge pacing in his guilt. And now, finally, she was on the other side of the glass, no longer the viewer, but the subject, trapped inside the diorama she had obsessively curated.
The door to the study was not just open, it was inviting, positioned at an angle that allowed a sliver of the interior to be seen, revealing a wall of books that stretched from floor to ceiling, their spines dull and indistinct in the low light. And as she pushed the door fully open with the tip of her cane, the hinges gave a low, mournful groan that seemed to signal the point of no return.
The room was dominated by the fireplace, where a small, controlled fire crackled in the grate, providing the only illumination and explaining the flickering light she had seen from the street. But it was not the fire that arrested her attention, nor was it the empty tumbler of scotch resting on the mahogany desk, but rather the figure seated in the judge's high-backed leather chair, turned away from her, facing the window that looked out onto the street.
"Closer," the figure said, and the voice was dry, like leaves scraping over pavement, lacking the sonorous boom of the judge, belonging instead to a throat that had inhaled too much smoke, or perhaps to a man who had spent a lifetime whispering in rooms where he wasn't supposed to be.
Evelyn stepped onto the hardwood floor of the study, the sound of her cane finally making contact, a sharp tack that punctuated the crackling of the fire, and she saw that the desk was covered not in legal briefs or court documents, but in photographs, dozens of them, spread out in a chaotic fan like a losing hand of poker. She moved to the edge of the desk, her eyes adjusting to the firelight, and the breath froze in her lungs as she looked down at the images, expecting to see crime scene photos of the arson, expecting to see the blackened ruins of the warehouse from 1998. But instead, she saw herself. There were photos of her checking her mail, photos of her pruning the dead roses in her front garden, grainy, high-contrast photos taken with a telephoto lens, showing her silhouette in the window of House 12, her eye pressed to her own telescope, capturing the irony of the watcher being watched, a loop of surveillance that had been tightening around her neck for months, without her ever feeling the noose. "The red file covers the acquittal," the man said, and the chair began to swivel slowly, the leather groaning under his weight, turning to face her. "It documents the bribe Judge Thorne took to let my father walk free, and it documents the suppression of the witness testimony. But you made a fundamental error, Evelyn, an error common to historians and archivists who believe that the past is a static thing that can be trapped in a box." He came into view, the firelight catching the side of his face, revealing the sharp, angular jawline of the young man she had seen visiting the house. But his eyes were old, tired, and devoid of the malice she had expected, filled instead with a weary sort of pity. "You assumed the story ended with the acquittal," he continued, gesturing to the empty chair opposite the desk, an invitation that felt more like a command. "You assumed that my father was the villain, and the judge was the corrupt official, and you, the noble observer, were the only one holding the scales of truth. But you never asked yourself why the judge let him go, or what the fire was actually meant to burn." Evelyn gripped her cane, using it as a barrier between them,
her mind reeling as she tried to reconcile the narrative she had constructed over 2 decades with the reality sitting before her, realizing that the red file in her basement was not the weapon she thought it was, but merely a single chapter in a book she had never actually read. "I am not sitting," she said, her voice trembling but firm, clutching the shred of authority she had left.
"Where is Marcus? Where is the judge?" The young man smiled, a sad, fleeting expression that vanished as quickly as it appeared, and he reached into the breast pocket of his jacket, withdrawing a small silver key that glinted in the firelight. "Marcus is indisposed," he said softly, placing the key on the desk and sliding it across the polished wood until it rested just inches from her hand.
He realized quite recently that the debt he owed my family could not be paid with money, and that the silence he purchased 20 years ago was renting space in a house that was about to collapse.
Evelyn looked at the key, recognizing it instantly, for it was an antique skeleton key, the kind that opened the heavy, erratic locks of the older homes on Willow Lane. But it was not a key to the judge's house, nor was it a key to her own. It was a small, brass key, labeled with a tag that bore a single, handwritten address: House 4.
"The arson wasn't about insurance money, Evelyn," the young man said, leaning forward, his face dipping into the shadow so that only his hands remained visible, clasping together on top of the photographs of her. "It was about destroying records, specifically the adoption records stored in the basement of the municipal building that burned, records that connected half the families on this street to a singular, unpleasant event in 1978.
The room seemed to tilt, the floorboards rolling beneath her feet like the deck of a ship in a storm, as the implications of his words crashed into the carefully organized architecture of her suspicions, shattering the walls she had built around the arsonist's guilt. "You brought the red file because you thought it proved a crime," he whispered, the sound seeming to come from the walls themselves.
But the crime isn't in the fire, Evelyn. The crime is in the blood. And if you truly want to conclude your story, if you truly want to be the archivist you claim to be, you need to stop looking at the smoke and start looking at who lit the match.
He stood up then, a slow, unfolding movement that made him seem impossibly tall in the low-ceilinged room, and he walked past her, moving toward the door she had just entered, leaving her alone with the fire, the photographs, and the key. "I'm leaving now," he said, pausing at the threshold, his back to her, his silhouette framed by the darkness of the hallway.
"The judge left something for you in the bottom drawer, something that pairs with the key, but I would advise you to sit down before you open it, because the truth, unlike the fire, does not burn itself out."
Evelyn stood frozen, listening to his footsteps recede down the hallway, listening to the slow, heavy thud of his boots on the stairs, and finally, the distant click of the front door opening and closing, sealing her inside the house with the ghosts of her own misconceptions. She was alone.
The fire popped, a harsh sound in the silence, and Evelyn looked down at the desk, at the silver key, and then at the bottom drawer of the desk, which was slightly ajar, revealing the edge of a thick, leather-bound ledger that smelled of mildew and earth. Her hand trembled as she reached out, her fingers brushing the cold brass handle of the drawer, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs, knowing that opening it would destroy the safety of her observation, knowing that she was about to cross the line from witness to accomplice. But the pool of the mystery was a gravity she could not resist. She hooked her finger around the handle. She pulled. The drawer slid open with a smooth, silent glide, and there, resting on top of the ledger, was a single, pristine envelope made of heavy cream stock, her name written on the front in the judge's sprawling, chaotic handwriting, and beneath the envelope, nestled in the velvet lining of the drawer, a black telephone began to ring. The ringing was not a sound so much as a physical intrusion, a mechanical vibration that seemed to emanate from the very bones of the house, rather than the antique device nestled in the velvet lining of the drawer. And for a long moment Evelyn Reed did nothing but stare at the black bakelite curve of the receiver, her breath caught in a painful hitch within her chest, because a telephone in a drawer that had been locked for 20 years should not have a connection to the outside world, nor should it possess the capacity to ring in the dead of night.
The sound was a dull, rhythmic trill, muffled by the heavy oak of the desk and the accumulated dust of the library. But to Evelyn's heightened senses, it roared like a siren, tearing through the carefully constructed silence of her sanctuary, and she found herself paralyzed by the implication of the noise. For if the phone was ringing, it meant there was a line, and if there was a line, it meant that someone, somewhere, had maintained it, kept it alive, waiting for this specific moment to bridge the distance between the forgotten past and the terrifying present.
She looked at the envelope with her name on it, the cream stock glowing faintly in the dim light of the desk lamp, the judge's handwriting sprawling and chaotic like a spider web spun in a fever dream, and the juxtaposition of the letter and the ringing phone created a vertigo that made her grip the edge of the desk until her knuckles turned the color of old parchment. The phone rang a third time, a demanding, patient sound, and Evelyn reached out, her hand trembling, not with the palsy of age, but with the vibrating frequency of pure adrenaline, her fingers hovering over the cold black plastic, the air in the room seemingly thickening, becoming viscous and hard to breathe, as if the oxygen were being sucked into the receiver to feed the voice on the other end. She lifted the receiver. She brought it to her ear, the plastic cold against her flushed skin, and she said nothing, her mouth dry, her vocal cords frozen, waiting for the voice, waiting for the threat, waiting for the confirmation that her quiet life on Willow Lane was nothing more than a stage play that was about to be canceled. There was no voice. There was only the sound of breathing, a wet, heavy respiration that sounded magnified, as if the person on the other end were holding the mouthpiece directly against their lips, a rhythm of inhalation and exhalation that sounded disturbingly familiar, distinct in its cadence, a slow, labored wheeze that spoke of age or illness, or perhaps just the sheer effort of existing in a world that required so many secrets.
"Hello," she whispered, the word barely a ghost of a sound, a violation of her own rule of silence. The breathing stopped.
There was a click, sharp and final, followed by the infinite, hollow hum of the dial tone, a drone that sounded like the flat line of a dying machine, and Evelyn slowly lowered the receiver back into its cradle, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird, the silence of the library rushing back in to fill the void left by the connection. But the silence was different now. It was no longer empty, it was heavy, charged with the static of observation.
She looked down at the envelope again, and with a sudden, jerky motion that betrayed her composure, she snatched it up, expecting it to be heavy, expecting it to contain the answers. But it was light, almost weightless, and when she tore open the seal, her fingers tearing the expensive paper with uncharacteristic violence, she found only a single index card inside. It was blank. She turned it over, staring at the white emptiness, searching for invisible ink, for a watermark, for an indentation of a pen that had run out of ink, but there was nothing, absolutely nothing, and the blankness was more terrifying than a threat, for a threat gives you a direction, a focus, something to fight against, but a blank page is a mirror, reflecting only your own paranoia, your own guilt, forcing you to fill in the empty space with your worst nightmares.
She dropped the card into the drawer and shoved it shut, the heavy thud of the wood sounding like a coffin lid closing.
and she backed away from the desk, her eyes wide, scanning the shadows of the library. The towering shelves of books that had always been her friends, now looming like silent judges, their spines turned away from her, their knowledge inaccessible. It was then that she smelled it. At first, it was faint, a subtle shift in the olfactory landscape of the room, a thin ribbon of scent weaving through the smell of old paper, leather, and lemon polish, a scent that shouldn't be there, a scent that belonged to the outdoors, to disaster, to destruction. Smoke.
Not the comforting aroma of a wood fire in the hearth, not the nostalgic scent of burning leaves in autumn, but the acrid, biting stench of something synthetic scorching, of plastic and rubber and electrical wiring giving up their ghosts to heat, a sharp, chemical tang that coated the back of her throat and made her eyes water. Evelyn spun around, her gaze darting to the fireplace, but the grate was cold and empty, swept clean days ago, the ashes disposed of with her usual meticulous efficiency. And she looked to the corner where the old radiator stood, checking for a leak, for a spark, but the iron was cool to the touch, silent and dormant.
She moved out of the library, her slippers whispering on the hardwood floor of the hallway, the smell growing stronger as she moved. Or perhaps it was not growing stronger, perhaps it was moving with her, attached to her, a phantom miasma that had no source in the physical world, but was billowing out of the recesses of her own memory.
She checked the kitchen, her hands flying over the stove knobs, checking the toaster, the coffee pot, the oven, but everything was off, everything was cold, the stainless steel gleaming with a mocking sterility, and yet the smell persisted, a thick, choking presence that made her cough, a dry, hacking sound that echoed too loudly in the empty house.
She went to the front window, the large bay window that looked out onto Willow Lane, thinking that perhaps the fire was outside, that perhaps one of the neighbors was burning trash, or that a car had stalled and overheated, and she pressed her face against the cold glass, her breath fogging the pane for a second before fading, creating a temporary veil through which she had to peer.
The street was dark, the street lamps casting pools of sickly yellow light on the asphalt, the shadows stretching long and distorted between the pools, and the air outside looked clear, no haze, no plumes of gray rising into the night sky, the stillness of the suburban landscape absolute and unbroken. But then she saw movement.
Across the street, 2 houses down, standing on the immaculate sidewalk in front of house number 1, the judge's fortress, was a figure, a silhouette cut from the darkness, rigid and unmoving, staring not at the judge's door, but directly at her, directly at house number 12. It was Martha Higgins.
The woman they called the Crow stood wrapped in a long, dark coat that swallowed her form, her posture erect and militaristic, her head cocked slightly to the side in that avian manner that had earned her the nickname. And even across the distance, even through the distortion of the glass and the darkness of the night, Evelyn could feel the weight of Martha's gaze, a tactile pressure that bored through the window and pinned her to the spot.
Martha was not alone. The front door of house number 1 opened, a slice of warm, golden light spilling out onto the porch, cutting through the shadows, and Judge Marcus Thorne stepped out, leaning heavily on his cane, his white hair a halo in the backlighting. And he did not look at Martha. He did not look at the street. He looked straight at Evelyn's window, as if he knew exactly where she was standing, as if he had been waiting for her to appear. They did not speak, or if they did, the distance swallowed their words, but the communication was evident in their stillness, in the way Martha turned slightly to acknowledge him without breaking her visual lock on Evelyn's house, a silent exchange of information between 2 generals on a battlefield, and Evelyn realized with a sickening lurch of her stomach that the neighborhood watch was not a quirky suburban club. It was not a group of bored retirees looking for something to do.
It was a perimeter. It was a containment unit, and she was the thing being contained.
The smell of smoke flared in her nostrils, violent and sudden, as if someone had struck a match directly under her nose, and she recoiled from the window, stumbling back into the darkness of her living room, her hands clutching at her throat, the realization crashing down on her that the smoke was not a fire in the house, but a signal from her own brain, a somatic warning that the walls were closing in, that the safety she had curated for decades was dissolving like sugar in hot water. She had to move the files. The thought was crystalline, sharp, and undeniable, cutting through the panic and the phantom smoke, a directive that bypassed logic and went straight to the primitive survival instinct buried deep in her lizard brain. For if they were watching, if they were coordinating, then it was only a matter of time before they came in, before they found the reason for her solitude, the leverage she had held in reserve for so long.
She turned and moved toward the staircase, her movements no longer fluid but jerky and frantic, her shadow dancing on the walls like a frantic marionette, and she ascended the stairs, the wood groaning under her weight, each creak sounding like a gunshot in the silence, her mind racing through the inventory of her secrets.
She did not go to the master bedroom, nor to the guest room that had not seen a guest in 15 years, but to the small sewing room at the end of the hall, a room filled with boxes of fabric, spools of thread, and the dressmaker's dummy that stood in the corner like a headless sentinel, a room that appeared chaotic and cluttered, the perfect camouflage for something that needed to remain hidden.
She fell to her knees beside the large cedar chest at the foot of the cutting table, the smell of cedar momentarily overpowering the phantom smoke, a clean, sharp scent that grounded her, and she pushed aside the heavy quilts and the moth-eaten wool blankets, her fingers searching for the catch, the hidden mechanism that she had installed herself years ago, a piece of craftsmanship she had been proud of, a secret within a secret.
She found the knot in the wood, the one that was slightly darker than the rest, and she pressed it, feeling the satisfying click of the spring, loaded latch, and the false bottom of the chest popped up a fraction of an inch, revealing the shallow compartment beneath, the dark space where she kept the ledger, the real ledger, the one that mirrored the judge's, but contained the things he had left out, the observations she had made from her window, the times, the dates, the license plates of the cars that came and went in the middle of the night. She lifted the false bottom, her hands shaking so badly that she almost dropped the wood back into place, and she stared into the compartment, her heart stopping for a full second, the blood draining from her face, leaving her cold and gray in the moonlight that filtered through the blinds. The ledger was there, but it was moved. It was shifted, just slightly, rotated perhaps 5 degrees to the left, a deviation that would have been invisible to anyone else, to anyone who did not possess the obsessive, compulsive need for order that defined Evelyn Reed's life. But to her, to the woman who measured the distance between her coaster and the edge of the table, it was a screaming, chaotic anomaly. She reached in, her fingers brushing the leather cover, and she felt a texture that shouldn't be there, a gritty, granular dust that felt like ash, and she pulled the book out, holding it up to the light, her breath coming in shallow, panicked gasps. She opened it.
She flipped through the pages, the paper crisp and yellowed, her own handwriting neat and precise, columns of dates and times, notes on the comings and goings of the residents of Willow Lane, the innocuous details that, when stitched together, formed a tapestry of conspiracy. And she scanned the entries, looking for the last one she had made, the entry from 3 days ago, when she had seen Julian Vane carrying a shovel into his backyard at 3 in the morning.
The page was gone. It wasn't torn out. That would be too messy, too obvious. It had been sliced. Razor, cut, close to the binding, a surgical excision that left only the faintest strip of paper behind, a jagged white line that ran down the inner spine of the book, a wound in the memory of the ledger. And Evelyn stared at the gap, her mind reeling, trying to process the impossibility of what she was seeing. She lived alone. She had the only key to the front door, the only key to the back door, and the windows were alarmed, the system old but functional. And she never left the house for more than an hour at a time, only for groceries, only for the necessities, and always during the day,
always with the paranoia of a spy in enemy territory. Someone had been in her house. Someone had walked up her stairs, entered her sewing room, knelt where she was kneeling now, opened the secret compartment that she believed to be impenetrable, and they had not taken the book, they had not destroyed it, they had simply edited it, removed a specific piece of information, and then replaced it, leaving it there for her to find, or perhaps hoping she wouldn't notice, hoping that her memory was as fragile as her age suggested.
But the missing page wasn't the worst part.
As she held the book open, the smell of smoke returned, violent and undeniable, billowing up from the open pages of the ledger itself, and she realized with a horror that froze her marrow that the smell was not a hallucination, it was a residue. The pages reeked of it. They were saturated with the scent of burning tobacco, of a specific, heavy pipe tobacco that she hadn't smelled in years, a blend that was rich and cloying and distinctly masculine.
Silas Blackwood, the taxidermist in House 13. He smoked a pipe, a curved briar pipe that he puffed on while he worked in his garage, surrounded by the glass eyes and the skins of dead things, and the scent was his signature, his olfactory fingerprint. And here it was, stamped into the fibers of her most secret possession, a calling card left by a ghost who walked through locked doors.
Evelyn dropped the book, unable to touch it any longer, feeling as if the leather were burning her skin, and it hit the floor with a heavy thud, splaying open like a dead bird, the missing page mocking her with its absence. She scrambled backward, scuttling across the floor like a crab, putting distance between herself and the chest, her back hitting the leg of the dressmaker's dummy, the impact jarring the mannequin so that it wobbled, its headless form looming over her, casting a long, decapitated shadow across the floorboards. She needed to leave. She needed to get out of the house, out of this trap. She needed to run to the street, to scream, to alert the police. But who would she call? The judge was the law. Martha was the watch. They were the ones outside. They were the ones waiting. And if Silas Blackwood had been in her house, if he had been in her sewing room, then where was he now?
The question hung in the air, suspended in the dust motes, and Evelyn listened, straining her ears against the silence of the house, listening for the creak of a floorboard, for the rustle of clothing, for the wet, heavy breathing she had heard on the phone. The house was silent. But it was a deceptive silence, a silence that felt held, as if the house itself were holding its breath, waiting for the punchline, and Evelyn slowly, painfully, pulled herself to her feet, her knees cracking, her hands trembling uncontrollably. She had to check the basement.
The thought was irrational, a horror movie cliché, but she knew, with a certainty that defied logic, that the answer was down there, that the source of the draft, the entry point, the breach in her fortress, was in the cellar, in the dark, damp space that ran the length of the house, the space she avoided, the space where the old coal chute had been bricked up years ago, or had it.
She moved out of the sewing room, clutching the doorframe for support, and walked back down the hallway, past the stairs, past the library where the phone sat in its cradle, past the kitchen where the phantom smoke still lingered, and she approached the narrow door under the staircase, the door that led down into the earth. It was locked. She always kept it locked, a heavy iron bolt that she slid into place every night before bed, a ritual of containment, keeping the darkness of the basement separate from the light of the living space. And she reached out, her hand wrapping around the cold metal of the bolt, expecting resistance, expecting to have to slide it back. The bolt was already drawn. It was slid back, the metal tongue retracted into its housing, the door standing unlatched, held closed only by the friction of the warped wood against the frame, and Evelyn stared at it, her mind refusing to accept the visual data, because she remembered locking it. She remembered the sound of the metal sliding home, the feeling of security it gave her. She had locked it 3 hours ago.
which meant that someone had unlocked it from the inside.
Or someone had unlocked it from the outside and gone down. She reached out, her fingers trembling so violently that they brushed the wood like the wings of a moth, and she pushed. The door creaked, a high-pitched, rusty whine that sounded like a child crying in the distance, and the blackness of the basement yawned before her, a solid wall of dark that smelled of damp earth and mold, and something else. Fresh paint.
The smell was faint, buried under the mildew, but it was there, the chemical tang of latex and primer, a smell of renovation, of change, of covering things up, and it made no sense, for she had not painted the basement in 40 years. She had not touched it. She had left it to the spiders and the memories.
She stepped onto the landing, her hand groping for the light switch, the old toggle switch that protruded from the wall like a broken finger, and she flipped it. Nothing happened. The bulb had been unscrewed, or broken, or the fuse had been pulled, and the darkness remained absolute, a physical weight that pressed against her eyes, and she stood there, teetering on the edge of the abyss, listening. And then she heard it. From the bottom of the stairs, from the deepest corner of the cellar, came a sound. Scrape, scrape, scrape. It was the sound of something metal being dragged across concrete, a slow, rhythmic abrasion, like a shovel being pulled over stone, or a heavy box being shifted, or a chair being dragged by someone who was sitting in it, waiting. Evelyn wanted to scream, but her throat had constricted to the size of a pinhole, and she could only wheeze, a small, pathetic sound that was swallowed by the dark, and she took a step back, intending to slam the door, to lock it, to nail it shut, to burn the house down if she had to, anything to keep whatever was down there from coming up. But as she stepped back, her slipper caught on the edge of the rug in the hallway, and she stumbled, her hand flailing out to catch herself, and her fingers brushed against the wallpaper that she had chosen 30 years ago, a floral pattern of roses and vines. The wall was warm.
Not room temperature warm, but radiating heat, a dull, throbbing warmth that pulsed against her palm, as if there were a fire burning just on the other side of the plaster, as if the wall itself were alive and feverish. She froze, her hand pressed against the hot wall, her eyes fixed on the black rectangle of the basement door, and the scraping sound stopped. Silence returned, but it was different now. It was the silence of arrival.
And then, slowly, agonizingly slowly, a light appeared at the bottom of the stairs. It was not the harsh glare of a flashlight, nor the yellow glow of a bulb, but the flickering orange dance of a flame, a small, solitary light that cast long, dancing shadows up the stairwell, shadows that stretched and warped, reaching for her feet like grasping fingers.
The light grew brighter, ascending the stairs, floating upward, carried by an unseen hand, and Evelyn watched, mesmerized by the terror, unable to move, unable to breathe, as the source of the light came into view. It was a lighter.
A silver Zippo lighter, the flame standing tall and steady in the still air, held by a hand that was gloved in black leather, a hand that emerged from the darkness before the body followed, a disembodied limb offering fire to the dark. And behind the flame, illuminating a face that was half in shadow, half in orange light, a face that smiled with a familiarity that stopped Evelyn's heart cold. It was not the judge. It was not Martha. It was not Silas Blackwood. The face rising from her basement, holding the flame that smelled of the very smoke that had been haunting her all night, belonged to the one person she had trusted, the one person she had confided in, the one person she had told about the ledger in the first place. Mark Miller, the architect from house number 4.
He stood on the third step from the top, the flame illuminating the perfect knot of his tie, the smooth, handsome lines of his face, the calm, reassuring smile that he wore when he sold houses, when he explained blueprints, when he told her that everything was going to be all right. "Evelyn," he said, his voice soft, melodic, the voice of a neighbor borrowing a cup of sugar, the voice of a friend. "You left the light on upstairs. We can't have that."
He didn't look at her. He looked past her. He looked at the front door of the house. And as Evelyn turned, following his gaze, watching in slow motion as her world fractured into a kaleidoscope of betrayal, she saw the doorknob of her front entry, the door she had triple locked, the door that was her shield against the world, begin to slowly, silently turn. The lock tumbled with a heavy metallic clunk that sounded like the tolling of a bell. The door swung inward. The night air rushed in, cold and biting, carrying the scent of rain and wet asphalt, and the silhouette of Martha Higgins stood on the threshold, her face obscured by the darkness, her hand resting on the head of a large black cane. She stepped inside. Mark Miller snapped the lighter shut, plunging the hallway into darkness, leaving only the spill of the street lamps from the open door to illuminate the scene.
"We need to talk about the renovation, Evelyn." Mark's voice came from the dark, closer now, right beside her ear. "The foundation is rotting." Evelyn opened her mouth to speak, to beg, to scream, but the only thing that came out was a single terrified breath, a puff of white vapor in the suddenly freezing air as the door clicked shut behind Martha, sealing them all inside the tomb of house number 12.
The darkness that followed the extinguishing of the lighter was absolute, a heavy, suffocating blanket that seemed to instantly erase the familiar geography of the hallway, leaving Evelyn suspended in a void, where the only coordinates were the sound of her own ragged breathing and the terrifying, electric proximity of the two figures who had invaded her sanctuary.
The smell of the smoke did not dissipate with the flame, but rather seemed to thicken, a cloying, acrid scent of lighter fluid and charred wick that mingled with the damp, earthy odor of the rain that had blown in with Martha, creating a sensory dissonance that made Evelyn's head swim. For it was the smell of the burning house from her nightmares, the smell that she had been sensing for days in her impeccably clean living room, a phantom scent she had dismissed as a hallucination born of guilt, but which she now understood was a residue of intrusion, a physical marker left by visitors who had been walking through her home while she slept.
Mark Miller did not grab her, for violence would have been too crude, too unrefined for a man who viewed the world through the precise, geometric lens of an architect. But his presence at her shoulder was a physical force, a wall of pressure that guided her without touching, steering her body through the gloom toward the living room, where the streetlights filtered through the heavy velvet drapes in thin gray slices that illuminated dust motes dancing in the disturbed air.
Martha moved ahead of them, the rhythmic thump, drag of her cane on the hardwood floor acting as a metronome for Evelyn's racing heart, a sound that seemed terribly loud in the vacuum of the house, signaling that the hierarchy of Willow Lane had shifted, that the elderly widow from house number 2 was no longer a fragile observer tending to her hydrangeas, but a warden stepping into her shift, her silhouette rigid and purposeful against the pale wash of light from the window.
They assembled in the living room, a space Evelyn had kept as a museum of domestic perfection, where not a coaster was out of place, and where the magazines were fanned with mathematical precision. But now, standing in the erratic shadows cast by the swaying oak tree outside, the room felt foreign, a stage set for a play she hadn't rehearsed. And as Mark moved to the fireplace, leaning casually against the mantel as if he were at a cocktail party rather than a home invasion, Evelyn's mind snapped back to the moment earlier that afternoon when she had opened the hidden cache behind the wainscoting to move the files.
She remembered the cold sweat that had slicked her palms when she counted the documents, the sickening lurch of her stomach when she realized the sequence was broken,
that page 42 was gone, leaving a jagged gap in the narrative of the judge's corruption. And looking at Mark now, seeing the way he watched her with that pitying, knowledgeable smile while idly flipping the silver Zippo over in his fingers, she realized the page hadn't been lost, nor had it been misplaced in her panic, but rather it had been retrieved. It dawned on her then, a slow, creeping horror that started at the base of her spine and worked its way up to the nape of her neck, that the missing page was proof of access, proof that for years, perhaps for the entire time she had lived in house number 12, she had not been the only one with a key, that while she slept, while she worked, while she showered, someone had been coming and going, a ghost with a physical form, who adjusted her papers, who moved her coffee cup, who planted the smell of smoke to test her sanity. And the security she had prized, the triple locks and the deadbolts, were merely theater, props to make her feel safe while the audience watched from the stalls.
The realization made the room spin, made the familiar furniture warp and twist into threatening shapes, because if they had been inside before, if they had taken the page, then they knew exactly where the rest of it was. And this performance, this terrifying visit, was not about finding the file, but about finding out who else Evelyn had told, about sealing the leak before the rot spread to the rest of the neighborhood's foundation.
"You're trembling, Evelyn," Martha said, her voice dry and rustling like dead leaves skittering over pavement, not looking at Evelyn, but examining a porcelain figurine on the side table with feigned interest, turning it over in her gloved hands as if checking for dust. "And there is no need for trembling, not when we are simply neighbors having a discussion about the neighborhood, about the safety of our little community, which is fragile, you know, as fragile as this little dancer."
She set the figurine down with a click that echoed like a gunshot in the quiet room, and the implication hung heavy in the air. The suggestion that the neighborhood watch was not merely a group of retirees with nothing to do, but a complex, breathing organism designed to protect the organism itself. A surveillance ring that had been watching Evelyn through the gaps in her blinds, cataloging her movements, timing her trips to the basement, and waiting for the moment she became a liability. Mark cleared his throat, a soft, polite sound, and the metallic clink of the lighter lid snapping open and shut resumed, a hypnotic focal point as he began to speak about structure, about how a single rotten beam can bring down a roof, about how secrets, like water damage, must be contained before they spread to the adjoining properties. And he wasn't talking about lumber or drywall, of course, but about the ledger, about the things Evelyn had seen and the things she had stolen. His voice was so reasonable, so terrifyingly calm, devoid of any anger or malice, that Evelyn felt the urge to apologize, to confess, to hand over everything just to make the tension stop, to make the intruders leave. But she knew, with a clarity that froze her blood, that giving them what they wanted would not make them leave, for they were not burglars seeking loot, they were erasers seeking to clean a stain, and she was the stain.
"The judge was very disappointed, Evelyn," Mark said, his voice dropping an octave, becoming intimate, as he finally looked directly at her, his eyes dark pools that reflected nothing. "He thought you understood the rules. He thought you appreciated the quiet, the order we maintain here. But then you started digging. You started asking questions that have no answers. And when you took that file, you didn't just steal paper. You stole our peace of mind."
He took a step toward her, the floorboard groaning under his weight, the sound mirroring the groan of the house settling in the wind. And Evelyn backed away until her legs hit the edge of the sofa, trapping her, forcing her to sit, forcing her to look up at him like a child awaiting discipline. Martha turned from the table, her eyes glinting in the gloom, and reached into her oversized handbag, the leather creaking as her hand rummaged deep inside, bypassing the mundane items of a grandmother's purse, the tissues and the mints. And her hand stopped, her fingers curling around something heavy, something hard, and Evelyn held her breath, her lungs burning, waiting for a weapon, waiting for the end. But when Martha's hand emerged, it held only a small gray dictaphone, the red light already blinking, a single unblinking eye staring at Evelyn in the dark.
"Start from the beginning, dear," Martha whispered, placing the device on the coffee table, where it sat between them like a judge's gavel, the magnetic tape inside hissing softly as it spun. "And don't leave out the part about who you met at the library, because we already know about him. We just need to hear you say it."
Evelyn stared at the recorder, the little red light pulsing in time with her heartbeat, and she realized that the paranoia she had felt earlier, the sensation of the walls closing in, was not a delusion, but a premonition. For the walls were indeed closing in, not metaphorically, but in the form of Mark and Martha, who stood like pillars of the community, guarding the secrets of Willow Lane with a polite, lethal determination.
She opened her mouth to speak, to lie, to say anything that would buy her time, but her throat was dry, her voice stolen by the sheer weight of their presence, and as she struggled to find words, her eyes drifted past Mark, past the flickering lighter, toward the hallway they had just left, toward the staircase that led up to the second floor. It was then that she heard it. Above the hiss of the tape recorder, above the drumming of the rain against the glass, came a sound from upstairs, from the bedroom she had just left, the distinct, unmistakable creak of the floorboard right beside her bed, followed by the slow, deliberate turning of the handle on her bedroom door, a sound that froze Mark in mid-sentence and caused Martha to turn her head sharply toward the ceiling. For all three of them knew, with a terrifying certainty, that there was no one else in the house.
The silence that followed the sound of the turning handle was not empty, but heavy, a physical substance that poured down the staircase and pooled around their ankles, thick with the dust of 20 years and the unspoken terrors that thrive in the quiet corners of old houses.
Mark Miller stood frozen, his hand still hovering near the lighter he had flicked only moments before, the flame having long since died, but the heat of the metal still burning against his thumb. And he looked at Martha, the woman who claimed to watch over this street, the woman who claimed to know everything that happened on Willow Lane, and he saw for the first time that her mask had slipped, revealing not the stern protector of the neighborhood watch, but a frightened old woman who realized she had walked into a trap she did not understand.
Evelyn Reed did not move. She did not look up at the ceiling. She did not gasp or recoil, but instead she remained seated in her armchair, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her eyes fixed on the empty fireplace, as if she were waiting for a guest she had invited a long time ago, a guest who was finally, after 2 decades of delays, arriving to collect what was owed.
The creaking of the floorboard above them ceased, replaced by a stillness that was somehow worse, a pregnant pause that suggested whoever or whatever was upstairs had stopped moving not because they were gone, but because they were listening, pressing their ear to the floorboards to hear the breathing of the 3 souls trapped in the parlor below.
Mark shifted his weight, the leather of his shoes squeaking against the hardwood, a sound that seemed deafening in the vacuum of the room, and he opened his mouth to whisper, to ask who else had a key, who else could possibly be in a house that Evelyn lived in alone. But Martha raised a hand, a sharp, trembling gesture that commanded silence, her eyes darting toward the hallway, toward the front door, and then back to the stairs, her mind racing through the roster of neighbors, calculating who was home, who was away, and who had the audacity to break into House 12 while the lights were still on.
But the sound did not come again from upstairs. Instead, the atmosphere in the room shifted, the air pressure dropping, as if a storm were gathering not outside the windows,
where the rain continued its relentless assault against the glass, but inside the very walls of the house, a pressure that pressed against the eardrums and made the heartbeat a little slower, a little harder, thumping against the ribs like a trapped bird.
Evelyn finally turned her head, her neck moving with the slow, grinding precision of a rusted mechanism, and she looked at Mark, her eyes devoid of fear, devoid of surprise, filled only with a profound, exhausted resignation. And she spoke, her voice barely a whisper, saying that he should not worry about the upstairs, for the ghosts of this house did not live in the attic. They lived at the front door.
And as if summoned by her words, as if the script of this night had been written long before any of them were born, there was a knock. It was not the frantic pounding of an intruder, nor the polite rapping of a delivery man, but a slow, deliberate, rhythmic thud, 3 times, heavy and authoritative, the sound of wood on wood, the sound of a gavel striking a sounding block, echoing through the hallway and shattering the tension of the upstairs noise, drawing their attention away from the ceiling and toward the entrance, toward the barrier that separated the sanctuary of the living room from the wet, dark reality of Willow Lane.
Martha exhaled, a sound that was half relief and half dread, for she knew that knock. She had heard it in her dreams. She had heard it in the town hall meetings when order was called. She had heard it echoing from the porch of House 1 for as long as she could remember.
Mark looked between the 2 women, confused by the shift in their demeanor, confused by the way Evelyn closed her eyes and leaned her head back against the chair, exposing her throat as if accepting a blade. And he took a step toward the hallway, driven by the instinct to protect, to answer, to do something other than stand in the suffocating amber light of the parlor.
He walked down the hallway, the floorboards groaning under his feet, the shadows stretching out from the coat rack like grasping fingers, and he reached the door, his hand trembling as he gripped the cold brass of the knob. And he hesitated for a fraction of a second, a moment of instinctual warning that told him to leave the door locked, to barricade it, to retreat into the dark and wait for morning. But the knock came again, a single final thud that demanded obedience.
Mark turned the lock, the mechanism clicking loudly, and he pulled the door open, the wind and the rain rushing in to greet him, bringing with them the smell of wet asphalt and dying leaves. And there, standing on the porch, illuminated by the flickering yellow light of the street lamp, was Judge Marcus Thorne.
He did not look like the titan of Willow Lane in that moment. He did not look like the man who held the keys to the city's secrets. He looked old, impossibly old, his raincoat soaked through and clinging to his frame like a shroud, his white hair plastered to his skull, water dripping from the end of his nose and from his chin, his eyes red, rimmed and hollow, staring past Mark, past the hallway, staring directly into the heart of the house, as if the walls were made of glass.
He did not speak to Mark. He did not acknowledge the young architect's presence. He simply stepped forward, crossing the threshold with a heavy, limping gait, bringing the storm inside him, leaving muddy footprints on the pristine runner rug that Evelyn had kept spotless for 20 years. And Mark found himself stepping aside, pressing his back against the wall to let the old man pass, compelled by a force of personality that required no words, a gravity that bent the will of those around him.
Martha had come to the doorway of the parlor, her hands clutching her cardigan, her face pale. And when she saw Thorne, she did not greet him. She did not ask him what he was doing out in such weather. She simply nodded, a gesture of deference, a gesture of surrender, acknowledging that the hierarchy of the street had reasserted itself, that the queen of the watch was nothing in the presence of the king of the court.
Thorne stopped at the entrance to the living room, water pooling around his shoes, and he looked at Evelyn, who had not stood up, who had not opened her eyes, who sat in her chair like a statue carved from grief.
and for a long moment, the only sound in the house was the ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner and the dripping of water from the judge's coat.
"Leave us," Thorne said, his voice a ruin, a gravelly rasp that sounded like stones grinding together at the bottom of a well. And he did not look at Mark or Martha when he said it. He kept his eyes fixed on Evelyn, his gaze intense and unwavering.
Mark bristled, the protective instinct flaring up again, and he stepped into the room, saying that he wasn't going anywhere, that he wanted answers, that they were talking about the fire, about the blackmail, about the files. But Martha reached out and grabbed his arm, her grip surprisingly strong, her fingernails digging into his bicep through his shirt, and she shook her head, whispering that it was over, that this was not their conversation to have, that they were merely spectators who had stumbled onto the stage after the curtain had fallen.
"Mark," Evelyn said, opening her eyes finally, her voice clear and calm, cutting through the tension like a silver knife. "Please, go home to Sarah. This is between the judge and the librarian."
There was a finality in her tone that brooked no argument, a dismissal that was not unkind but absolute, and Mark looked from Evelyn to Thorne, seeing the invisible tether that connected them, a line of tension and history that was thick and unbreakable. And he realized that he was an intruder here, that his presence was a violation of a ritual that had been decades in the making. He let Martha pull him away, let her guide him back down the hallway, past the dripping raincoat of the judge, out into the cold, wet night. And as the door clicked shut behind them, leaving them on the porch in the rain, Mark felt a sudden, overwhelming sense of relief, a feeling that he had just stepped off the edge of a cliff and been caught by the wind. While inside, the house seemed to contract, sealing itself tight against the world.
Inside House 12, the silence returned, but it was different now. It was shared. It was the silence of a confessional booth before the first sin is whispered.
Thorne unbuttoned his raincoat with shaking hands, the wet fabric peeling away to reveal a suit that was wrinkled and stained, a shadow of his usual impeccable attire, and he draped the coat over the back of the sofa, not caring that the water soaked into the upholstery, and he moved to the chair opposite Evelyn, the chair that had been empty for 20 years, the chair that Mark had sat in only minutes before, and he lowered himself into it with a groan of pain, his joints popping, his breath wheezing in his chest.
Evelyn watched him, her expression unreadable, her hands still folded in her lap, and she waited. She let him settle. She let him wipe the rain from his face with a handkerchief that he pulled from his pocket. She let him compose himself, for she was a librarian, and she knew that every story needed time to breathe, that you could not rush the ending just because you were tired of reading.
"You look tired, Marcus," she said softly, the use of his first name sounding strange in the room, an intimacy that felt forbidden, a breach of protocol that shocked the very air. "I am tired, Evelyn," he replied, leaning his head back, his eyes closing for a moment. "I have been tired since 1998. I have been tired since the day I signed the order."
I have been tired every time I walked past your house and saw the light in the window and knew you were in here, awake, keeping watch over a corpse that we buried together. It wasn't a corpse, Marcus, she said, her voice dropping an octave, becoming colder. It was a life. It was my life.
Thorne opened his eyes and looked at her, and the pain in his gaze was so raw, so naked, that it was difficult to look at, a mixture of love and loathing that had fermented over 2 decades into a poison that was slowly killing him. "We did what was necessary," he said, the old judicial authority trying to creep back into his voice, but failing, crumbling under the weight of the truth. "We protected the street. We protected the name."
We protected you. You protected yourself, Evelyn countered, but there was no venom in it, only a weary correction of the record. You protected the sanctity of the court. You couldn't have a scandal.
You couldn't have the wife of a prominent developer arrested for arson. You couldn't have the messy, ugly truth spilling out onto the manicured lawns of Willow Lane.
"Is that what you think?" Thorne asked, leaning forward, his hands gripping the arms of the chair, his knuckles white. "Is that what you've told yourself all these years in this dark house? That I did it for the reputation? That I did it for the politics?" "I have the file, Marcus," she said, nodding toward the desk in the corner, the desk where the tape recorder still sat, the tape having run out, the reel spinning uselessly in silence.
"I know what's in it. I know you suppressed the fire marshal's report. I know you paid off the insurance investigator. I know you destroyed the witness statements that placed me at the scene with the gasoline." "You have the file," Thorne repeated, a bitter smile touching his lips. "Yes, the leverage, the sword of Damocles you've hung over my head."
The reason I let you stay here, the reason I let you rot in this mausoleum, instead of sending you to a facility where you could have gotten help," he laughed, a dry, hacking sound. "But you never opened the sealed envelope at the back, did you, Evelyn? You read the reports, you read the bribes, but you never opened the personal letter I wrote to the file, the one I sealed with my own ring."
Evelyn frowned, a flicker of uncertainty crossing her face. "There is no letter." "There is," Thorne said, "tucked behind the photos of the charred nursery, tucked behind the blackened remains of the crib. I put it there. I knew you would steal the file. I knew you would keep it. I knew you needed to feel like you had power over me, because if you didn't have power over me, you would have to face the fact that you had no power over yourself."
He reached into his jacket pocket, not for a weapon, but for a cigarette case, a silver antique that he hadn't used in years, and he opened it, finding it empty, and he closed it again with a snap, his hands trembling. "I didn't save you because of the scandal, Evelyn. I didn't save you because of the court. I saved you because I loved you."
The words hung in the air, absurd and terrifying, transforming the narrative of the last 20 years from a political thriller into a tragedy of errors. Evelyn stared at him, her mouth slightly open, her mind reeling, trying to recontextualize every interaction, every glance, every moment of silence between them. "You loved me?" she whispered, the idea foreign, repulsed by it. "You barely spoke to me. You were my husband's friend."
"And watched you fade," Thorne said, his voice gaining strength, fueled by the confession. "I watched him crush you. I watched him build this neighborhood, this perfect little prison of Willow Lane, and I watched him brick you up inside it. I saw the bruises you covered with makeup. I saw the way you flinched when he raised his voice. I saw the light going out in your eyes, year after year, until there was nothing left but a shadow." He took a breath, the sound rattling in his chest. "And then came the fire. The fire at the old construction site. The fire that burned down the model home. The fire that was meant to destroy his legacy." He looked at her directly, his eyes piercing. "I knew it was you. Before the police, before the marshals. I saw you walking back that night."
"I saw the smell of gasoline on your hands, and when the case came to my desk, I couldn't let him win. I couldn't let him destroy you twice. So I destroyed the law instead." Evelyn sat back, the revelation washing over her, not as a comfort, but as a horror. She had thought she was the villain. She had thought she was the mastermind, the arsonist who had gotten away with it, the woman who held the judge hostage with her dark secret. But now, in the dim light of the parlor, she realized she had been the charity case. She had been the broken bird that the judge had wrapped in illicit legal protections, not out of fear,
but out of a twisted, silent pity. "I didn't want to be saved," she said, her voice trembling, her composure finally cracking. "I didn't want your pity, Marcus. I wanted to burn it down. I wanted to burn it all down. I wanted to stand in the ashes and scream."
I wanted to go to prison. At least in prison, the walls are honest. At least in prison, you know why you're there. And yet, Thorne said softly, you stayed. You stayed in the house he built. You stayed on the street he designed. You kept the file. Why, Evelyn? If you wanted to burn it all down, why didn't you release the file? Why didn't you turn me in?
Why didn't you confess? Evelyn looked around the room, at the heavy curtains, at the dust motes dancing in the lamplight, at the shadows that clung to the corners like spiderwebs. Because, she whispered, the truth finally being dragged out of her. Because, if I turned you in, then the story ends. And if the story ends, then I'm just a lonely old woman who set a fire because she was sad. As long as I kept the file. As long as I kept the secret, I was dangerous. I was powerful. I was the crow's nightmare. I was the judge's reckoning. She looked at Thorne, her eyes filling with tears that did not fall. I needed to be the monster, Marcus, because being the victim was too painful. Thorne nodded slowly, understanding, accepting. He stood up, his knees cracking, and he walked over to the desk. He didn't ask for permission. He picked up the manila folder that had been the center of so much speculation, the folder that Julian Vane had wanted to buy, that Martha had wanted to bury, that Mark had wanted to understand. He weighed it in his hand, feeling the density of the paper, the density of the years. He didn't open it. He didn't look for the letter he claimed was inside. He simply held it, and then he turned and walked to the fireplace.
"Marcus," Evelyn said, half rising from her chair, "what are you doing?"
"The statute of limitations has long passed, Evelyn," he said, his voice flat. "The court is closed. The husband is dead. The neighborhood has moved on. There are new people now, tech consultants, crypto investors. They don't care about our sins. They have their own."
He struck a match from the box on the mantel, the sound distinct and sharp, and he held the flame to the corner of the folder. The paper caught, curling and browning, the fire eating the secrets, consuming the lies, turning the evidence into smoke and ash. He held it until the heat threatened his fingers, until the flames were licking at the seal, and then he tossed it into the grate, onto the cold ashes of fires long extinguished. They watched it burn together. They watched the police reports curl up and vanish. They watched the witness statements turn to gray flakes. They watched the leverage, the blackmail, the power dissolve into nothingness. When the fire died down, leaving only a few glowing embers in the darkness of the grate, Thorne turned back to her. He looked lighter, as if a great weight had been lifted from his shoulders, but also emptier, as if his purpose had burned away with the paper. "You're free, Evelyn," he said. "No one is coming for you. No one is watching you. Martha will not speak. Mark will not speak. I will not speak." He walked back to the sofa and picked up his wet coat, shrugging it on, the dampness settling back over him like a second skin. He buttoned it slowly, his fingers clumsy. "Free?" Evelyn laughed, a hollow, bitter sound. "You call this free? You've taken away the only thing that made me matter. You've taken away my leverage. You've taken away my war." "The war was over 20 years ago," Thorne said, walking to the hallway. "We were just the only ones who didn't know it." He stopped at the front door, his hand on the knob, and he looked back one last time.
The house seemed to stretch out behind Evelyn, the hallway endless, the stairs leading up to the darkness where the floorboard had creaked, the kitchen where the knives were kept,
the library where the books were unread. "Goodbye, Evelyn," he said. "I won't be coming back. I'm selling the house. I'm moving to the coast. My daughter has a room for me." "You're leaving?" she asked, a sudden panic rising in her chest. "You can't leave."
"I was," he said. "Now I'm just an old man who wants to hear the ocean instead of the rain." He opened the door, and the wind howled, blowing rain into the hallway, swirling around his feet. He stepped out onto the porch, and without looking back, he pulled the door shut. The click of the latch was the loudest sound Evelyn had ever heard. She stood alone in the hallway. The house was silent. The file was gone. The judge was gone. Martha was gone. Mark was gone. She walked slowly back into the living room. She looked at the fireplace, where the last embers of the file were fading into gray ash. She looked at the chair where Thorne had sat, the indentation of his body still visible in the cushion, the wet spot on the armrest where his sleeve had rested. She sat down in her own chair. She folded her hands in her lap.
She listened to the house. She heard the wind rattling the window panes. She heard the rain drumming on the roof. She heard the refrigerator humming in the kitchen. She heard the settling of the foundation, the groan of the timbers, the whisper of the drafts. And then she heard it again, from upstairs, the distinct, unmistakable creak of the floorboard right beside her bed. Evelyn froze. Her heart hammered against her ribs.
She looked up at the ceiling. Thorne was gone. Mark and Martha were gone. She was alone. Or was she? She remembered what Thorne had said about the letter in the file. "I knew you would steal the file. I knew you needed to feel like you had power." She remembered the noise that had started it all tonight, the handle turning. She realized with a cold, dawning horror that the noise upstairs hadn't been a ghost. It hadn't been the wind.
It hadn't been a cat. The house was old. The house had secrets. The house had spaces between the walls, spaces in the attic, spaces that a person could live in if they were quiet, if they were careful, if they had nowhere else to go. She thought of the food that sometimes went missing from her pantry. She thought of the books that were sometimes moved on the shelves. She thought of the way the house always felt, occupied.
She had blamed it on her own forgetfulness. She had blamed it on the ghosts of her past. She had blamed it on the paranoia of her guilt. But as the floorboard creaked again, followed by the soft, rhythmic sound of pacing, back and forth, like a caged animal, Evelyn Reed realized the true nature of her punishment. She wasn't the warden of Willow Lane. She wasn't the powerful blackmailer holding the judge hostage. She wasn't even the tragic heroine of a romance. She was the inmate, and she was not in solitary confinement. She sat in the amber light, the silence of the street pressing in on all sides, and she stared up at the ceiling, listening to the footsteps of the unknown, the realization settling over her like the dust that covered every surface of her life. She could leave. She could stand up, walk to the door, open it, and run into the rain.
She could run to Mark's house. She could run to the police. But she didn't move, because this was her house. This was her prison. This was her life. And whatever was upstairs, whatever had been living in the shadows of House 12, watching her, listening to her, breathing the same air as her for 20 years, it was the only family she had left. Evelyn Reed closed her eyes. She leaned her head back.
"I know you're there," she whispered to the ceiling, her voice calm, measured, and terrified. The pacing stopped. The house held its breath. And in the silence, Evelyn waited for the floorboard to creak again, knowing
that the story of Willow Lane didn't end with a bang, or a fire, or a confession. It ended with the waiting. It ended with the darkness.
It ended with the neighbor at the end of the street, sitting in a chair, listening to the sound of something waking up above her head. The silence that followed her whisper was not empty, but heavy, a tangible substance that seemed to pour down from the ceiling like invisible smoke, filling the room with a pressure that made the simple act of drawing breath feel like a labor against the weight of the house itself.
She sat frozen in the amber light, her eyes fixed on the plaster above, waiting for the floorboard to creak again, waiting for the unknown tenant of her attic to acknowledge her challenge, waiting for the inevitable descent of whatever had been sharing her air for all these lonely years.
But the house offered no reply, only the settling of its ancient bones and the relentless, rhythmic drumming of the rain against the siding, a sound that washed over the world outside and sealed her into this capsule of time and memory.
She was prepared for the ceiling to crack open. She was prepared for footsteps on the stairs. She was prepared for the terrifying reality of a stranger's face emerging from the shadows of the hallway. But she was not prepared for the sound that actually came. It was a knock.
It was not the frantic pounding of a fugitive, nor the authoritative hammer of the police, but a soft, almost hesitant rap of knuckles against the heavy oak of the front door, a sound so polite and so incongruous with the terror of the moment that it shattered the spell of the upstairs room instantly.
Evelyn lowered her gaze from the ceiling, her neck stiff, her mind reeling as it tried to recalibrate from the threat above to the visitor below, and for a moment she simply stared at the front door, watching the brass handle dull in the low light, wondering if her mind had finally fractured enough to hallucinate the mundane courtesy of a guest.
The knock came again, 3 distinct taps, gentle yet insistent, demanding nothing but begging for acknowledgement, and Evelyn found herself standing up, her movements mechanical, drawn toward the entryway not by courage, but by the sheer magnetic pull of the inevitability that had been stalking her all night.
She walked past the staircase, forcing herself not to look up into the dark well of the second floor, forcing herself to ignore the lingering sensation of being watched from the balustrade. And she reached the door, her hand hovering over the lock, her breath held tight in her chest, as she imagined the horrors that might be waiting on the porch. She turned the latch.
The mechanism clicked, a sharp metallic sound that echoed like a gunshot in the quiet house, and she pulled the heavy door inward, revealing the wet, gray world of Willow Lane and the figure standing under the dripping eaves. It was Judge Thorne.
But it was not the Thorne of the courthouse, not the titan of industry who intimidated waitresses and silenced courtrooms with a glare. It was a man eroded by the rain and the years, his shoulders slumped under the weight of a soaking wet trench coat, his silver hair plastered to his skull, his face a landscape of ruin and exhaustion, illuminated by the flickering porch light.
He did not barge in. He did not shout. He did not wave a pistol or a subpoena. He simply stood there, water dripping from the tip of his nose, looking at her with eyes that held no anger, no malice, only a profound and terrifying sorrow that chilled Evelyn more than any threat could have. "Evelyn," he said, and his voice was a rusted hinge, a sound that scraped against the silence of the night. She stepped back, allowing him to cross the threshold, and as he entered the foyer, bringing the smell of ozone and wet wool and dying leaves with him, she realized that the dynamic she had constructed in her head for 20 years, the game of cat and mouse, the blackmailer and the victim, the warden and the prisoner, was a lie she had told herself to survive the crushing weight of her own history. Thorne closed the door behind him, shutting out the wind, and he leaned against the frame as if his legs could no longer support the burden of his secrets, and he looked at her, really looked at her, with the intimacy of a co-conspirator who has finally grown too tired to run.
I saw the lights, he whispered, his gaze drifting past her to the living room where the file still lay open on the table, the papers scattered like the debris of a wreck.
I knew you were reading it. I knew it was time.
Evelyn wanted to speak. She wanted to hurl the accusations at him. She wanted to demand to know why he had tormented her, why he had let her live in fear, why he had allowed the specter of the investigation to hang over her head like a guillotine blade. But the words died in her throat, because as she looked at him, the memories she had repressed, the memories she had buried under layers of paranoia and victimhood, began to claw their way to the surface.
She looked at the file on the table, and suddenly she wasn't seeing the black and white photos of a crime scene. She was seeing the color of the flames. She remembered the smell of gasoline, sharp and chemical, stinging her nose in the garage of the old house on Elm Street. Not in 1998, but in a lifetime that felt like a dream. She remembered the shaking of her own hands, not the hands of a victim, but the hands of an architect of destruction, striking the match that would burn down a marriage she couldn't escape, a debt she couldn't pay, a life that had become a cage so small she could no longer breathe within its bars.
She remembered the heat, the blistering, purifying heat that had consumed the evidence of her failures, and she remembered standing in the crowd as the sirens wailed, watching the roof collapse, weeping not for the loss, but for the terrifying, exhilarating relief of erasure. Thorne watched the realization wash over her face, and he nodded slowly, a single tear tracking through the rain on his cheek.
"You thought I kept the file to control you," he said, his voice barely audible over the hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. "You thought I was the villain who held your crime over your head, to keep you silent, to keep you close, to keep you here in this house."
He took a step toward her, and for the first time, Evelyn saw the truth of his obsession, the twisted, tragic reality of the man who had presided over her case, the judge who had looked at the evidence of her arson, the proof of her guilt, and had chosen not to sentence her, but to save her. "I didn't hide the evidence to protect myself, Evelyn," he whispered, the confession hanging in the air like smoke.
I destroyed my integrity. I ruined the investigation. I buried the truth of what you did because I loved you. The world tilted on its axis. The floorboards seemed to vanish beneath her feet. Evelyn reached out to steady herself against the wall, her mind reeling as the narrative of her life was rewritten in a single heartbeat. She was not the prey. She was the predator who had been protected by the very man she despised.
She had kept the file for 20 years, thinking it was her insurance policy, thinking it was the leash she held around the judge's neck, never realizing that it was actually a receipt for the soul he had sold to keep her out of prison. "I kept the file," Thorne continued, his voice breaking, "because it was the only thing I had that proved we were connected. It was the only thing that bound us together." "I wanted you to hate me, Evelyn, because if you hated me, you would think about me, and if you were afraid of me, you would never leave." He reached into his coat pocket, and Evelyn flinched, expecting a weapon. But he pulled out nothing. His hand came out empty, open, a gesture of surrender that was more final than any gunshot.
"But I am tired," he said, and the exhaustion in his voice was a physical thing, a deep, marrow-deep weariness that spoke of decades of sleepless nights and silent vigils. "I am tired of being the villain in your story so that you can pretend to be the victim. I am tired of watching you rot in this house, guarding a secret that everyone else has forgotten."
He turned back to the door, his hand resting on the brass knob, and he looked at her one last time, his eyes hollow, his expression void of expectation. "You are free, Evelyn," he said softly. "Not because I am letting you go, but
but because I am no longer willing to be your jailer. You set the fire. You burned down your life. And you have spent 20 years standing in the ashes, waiting for someone to tell you it's okay to walk away.
He opened the door, and the sound of the rain rushed in, louder now, a crescendo of water and wind that smelled of freedom and cold, hard reality. "The file is yours," he whispered, stepping out into the night. "Burn it, keep it. It doesn't matter anymore." And then he was gone.
He walked down the porch steps, his figure dissolving into the gloom of the street, his footsteps swallowed by the storm, leaving Evelyn standing in the open doorway, the cold mist spraying against her face, the file on the table behind her, and the devastating silence of the house settling around her shoulders like a shroud. She watched him disappear until the darkness was absolute, until there was no judge, no neighbor, no witness left in the world. And then, slowly, mechanically, she closed the door. She locked it. She slid the deadbolt home. She engaged the chain. She turned around and looked at the hallway. She was alone. The blackmailer was gone. The threat of prison was gone. The game was over. She was the arsonist. She was the criminal. And she was free.
But as she stood there, the silence of the house began to change, shifting from the emptiness of departure to the heavy, expectant pressure of presence. She looked at the file on the table. It was just paper. It had always been just paper. And then she heard it from upstairs, the creak of the floorboard.
It was louder this time, deliberate, a shifting of weight that was too heavy for a rat, too rhythmic for the wind, too purposeful for a settling beam. Evelyn froze, her hand still resting on the cold metal of the door chain, her eyes lifting slowly, painfully, to the top of the staircase, where the shadows gathered in a dense, impenetrable pool. Thorne had said she was free. Thorne had said he was done watching her.
But Thorne didn't know everything about House 12. Thorne didn't know that the house had its own memory, its own hunger, its own occupants who had been waiting patiently while the two humans played their petty games of guilt and redemption downstairs. The creak came again, followed by the soft sliding sound of a door opening in the hallway above, the door to the spare room, the room she never entered, the room where she had heard the breathing.
Evelyn didn't run. She didn't scream. She didn't reach for the phone to call the police, because she knew, with a clarity that was colder than the rain, that the police could not arrest what was up there, and that her sentence had not been commuted, but merely clarified. She walked to the bottom of the stairs. She placed her hand on the newel post, feeling the vibrations of the movement above, traveling down the wood like a pulse.
She looked up into the dark. "I'm coming up," she whispered. And as she took the first step, the phone in the kitchen began to ring.